We know that Lavan was blessed because of Yaakov, or through Yaakov, which is a template for the fact that the world is blessed because of or through the Jewish people. We're going to analyze exactly how that works and what kind of a role the rest of the world plays in the Jewish journey. When it comes to discussing the great brocha that Lavan had in his flocks, thanks to Yaakov, who was his shepherd, bringing sich in Zohar zwei deos, so there are two opinions in the Zohar how much brocha he got. Mit wieviel de mikne Lavan is vergrößert geworden, how many times increase was there to Lavan's flocks. The erste day is the first opinion, was as Lavan ashkach beginei de Yaakov, that because of Yaakov, Lavan found every single month, Mea Ana Kol Yarcha, or Mea Imrin, or Mea Yizin Yasal Ane, an extra 100 sheep, an extra 100 rams, an extra 100 goats every single month. Whereas the second opinion, or Rabbi Abba Amar, Rabbi Abba says actually was 10 times that. Elef Aniv, Elef Imrin, Elef Yizin, have a Maisi Lei Yaakov, Yatir B'chol Yarcha. Yaakov Avinu brought an extra 1,000 of each of the types of flocks to Lavan every single month. When Rabbi Abba quotes a pasuk to prove this, look at what Yaakov says. Vayevorech Hashem Yisrael Ragli, that the Eibishter blessed you because of me, and because it's a brocha from Hashem, says Rabbi Abba, the rule is a brocha de'eila lavi upachas me'elef is never less than 1,000-fold. So this is moving. We do understand that both opinions obviously must claim that this is a brocha from Hashem. Obviously, the first opinion also believes that the brachas to Lavan through Yaakov were Hashem's brachas. Which is evidenced by the pasuk that the Zohar is commenting over here. Which is where Lavan himself acknowledges that this is a divine bracha. I've looked into this and I've understood that my brachas came from Hashem through you. Because we generally try and avoid making too much machlokas. So if we have two opinions over here about how it is that the bracha came to Lavan, we want to diminish the area of conflict between the two opinions. The fact that the first opinion says that the bracha was only 100-fold, not 1,000-fold, like Rabbi Abba says, is it it's not because he disagrees with the principle that a divine bracha is always 1,000-fold. No, but rather because there are two possible ways that Hashem's bracha could manifest in our reality. The one is Aleph, the Amshach is Boifen, as Eicharab Kumen Diklamati is in Irnika Begoloi as his Birchas Adelaila. One possibility is when a bracha manifests in this world, you can detect, obviously, that this is a divine bracha. Which means that the actual physical manifestation of the bracha will be 1,000-fold, just like it is in dispatch in the higher realms. Or there's another possibility is based. There is a distinction between how the brocha is in the Eibishter's realm and how it translates into this world. That once you're down here in the physical reality, you cannot actually physically detect that this is divine brocha. Because there's a diminishing of the brocha from how it is in the Eibishter's world, which is 1,000-fold, to how it manifests in this world, which is only 100-fold. And that would be the opinion of the first Manda Omer in the Zohar, possibly. But what doesn't make sense is, as is Avanit Movan, both opinions, including the first one, agree that this is Hashem's bracha. Is my hechach zu sagen, as is nishtana geworden b'misra. There are two possibilities of how the bracha would enter this world. Why do we insist that it must be the second possibility, which is where things got diminished from the Eibishter's reality to this world? Why would that happen? In addition to that, let's have a look at the wording of here, because we'll see that there are some distinct differences between the opinion of the first Mandama and Rabbi Abba. Therefore, we have to understand, number one, Aleph, the fact that Rabbi Abba, to prove his point, that it's Hashem's bracha and therefore 1,000-fold, is from the bracha where Lavan himself acknowledges that Hashem blessed, the way Yaakov says, Hashem blessed you because of me. And he does not rely on the pasuk where Lavan says, "Oh, I realize that the Eibishter blessed me," which is firstly already quoted in the Zohar and is also earlier in the actual discussion in the parasha. That implies that there's something about the fact that when it's Yaakov Avinu saying that Hashem blessed you because of me, that's when you're getting the highest form of brocha. So Vayeitzei is from pasuk Vayivorech Hashem Hashem. So what is it about Yaakov Avinu saying that the Eibishter blessed you that is more compelling than Lavan saying, I know I was blessed because of you? The other thing we have to ask is, the presentation of the first mandam and Rabbi Abba about how the brocha came is also different. Base. What's the reason to distinguish was by Mersham mandam state that Lavan found 100-fold in Yaakov's chus every single month? Was is madgish wie Lavan hat bakum ta brocha beginne de Yaakov, which emphasizes that it's Lavan receiving a brocha, which by the way happens to be through Yaakov. And Rabbi Abba sagt elef chule have a maisele Yaakov, whereas Rabbi Abba says you got 1,000-fold that Yaakov brought him. But Yaakov hat gebracht brocha, which emphasizes the fact that Yaakov brought the brocha. Why that distinction? And noch mehr, let's take that a step further. Rabbi Abba will madgish sein wie Yaakov hat gebracht die brocha. If Rabbi Abba's intention over here is to emphasize the fact that the brocha comes to Lavan through Yaakov, bringing them pasuk shuva b'dei ha'alef Vayeitzei Hashem b'glolecha, then he should have quoted the brocha that says that Hashem blessed you because of me. That's very clear that it's saying the brocha comes to you b'glolecha. Where Lavan says to Yaakov, I was blessed because of you. Which is more than Yaakov saying, well, notice that the brochas are since I got you, because that's what l'ragli means, since I arrived here. The explanation is like this, that a brocha is not something which is out of thin air. A brocha means that there's a reservoir of potential that somebody has to help reach its intended recipient. The concept of a brocha generally is as mizmavrich or mamshich hashpo von zayin dem misborach shayrish umoker. A brocha is the manifestation of something that is already reserved for this particular individual who's the recipient of the brocha. Which means this particular brocha already has a link to the individual who's supposed to receive it, but for whatever reason he's not able to access the link, and therefore so the job of the mivarech is to make that connection and bring that brocha, deliver it to the intended recipient, like Yaakov Avinu gave the brochas to his sons that were already their brochas. And that will explain the difference between the first mandamer and Rabbi Abba. Whose brochas are we talking about over here? That's the distinction between these two commentaries. Who is the reservoir of brocha coming from? Is it Lavan's brochas that Yaakov is facilitating, or is it Yaakov's brochas that are coming to Lavan? So Leute, der Mandamer is das gefena brocha zu welcher Lavan is roi mit tzachoshem makor de Lavan. So the first Mandamer in the Zohar is saying there's a reservoir of brocha that is assigned to Lavan, but he can't get it of his own accord. No, so in order to facilitate that the brocha actually reaches Lavan, but it's brocha that belongs to Lavan, at least that he's shirish, so you need Yaakov to facilitate. On the Pharisee brocha given by Misper Meir, that's why the brocha is only 100-fold. While the Shlemus for Lavan is verbunden belois mit Misper Meir, Kidel Kamen Sifyud, because towards the end of the Sikha we'll explain that Lavan really only has access to a world that is represented, or a reality that is represented by the number 100. Therefore, his brocha can only be 100-fold because it's his brocha that Yaakov is facilitating. Mashenki Rabbi Abba halt. Rabbi Abba is saying there's something completely different happening over here. As the brocha gebracht Yaakov Vayeitzei kumne l'ragli bias ragli. It's when Yaakov arrives at the place, he brings a reservoir of brocha that was previously not there, that had no prior connection to Lavan. Gebracht zu Lavan. He brought the brocha to Lavan. Obviously, she is Yaakov's fi madrigose. But what brocha did he bring to Lavan? His brocha, which is relative to his level. So it's nimshach geworden Yaakov von sein shirish moker. Und hat die brocha gebracht zu Lavan. So this is now Yaakov digging into his reservoir of brocha and making that accessible to Lavan, which is obviously a much more powerful and much higher and stronger brocha. And the Pharisee brocha given by mispe elef, and that's why it's 1,000-fold in his version. But the shlemus von Yaakov is verbunden mit elef kidel kaman sham, because also towards the end of the sikha we'll explain why Yaakov is dafka keyed into a reality represented by the number 1,000. And that obviously explains some of the language nuances that we've already identified. The first opinion says Lavan found brocha. Lavan had gefunden sein brocha. Now the gefunden is beginning to Yaakov, but how did he find the brocha? Thanks to Yaakov. But it's his brocha that he found. And the Farbrengt the pasuk was Lavan hat gesagt. That's why he quotes the pasuk where Lavan says, "I realize this is my brocha. I worked this out. As Vayeitzei Hashem, that the Eibishter blessed me. Now the sib is given biglolecha, but the way that brocha was facilitated, my brocha was facilitated, was through you, Yaakov." Whereas Rabbi Abba is madgish, Rabbi Abba says, no, as have a maisele Yaakov. Yaakov brought him the brocha. The brocha is given berchasa shel Yaakov. It's Yaakov's brocha that became available now to Lavan because Yaakov is here. And hat sie gebracht zu Lavan, und der Farbrengt the pasuk was Yaakov hat gesagt, Vayivorach Hashem ha'yisrael l'ragli bevias ragli. That's why his pasuk is the pasuk that says Yaakov is telling Lavan, you know why the brocha is here? Because I came, and therefore I brought you that brocha. Let's understand this better. In order to understand it, we're going to understand the principle of why tzaddikim bring brocha to a place. Why is it that Yaakov was able to bring brocha to Lavan's possessions? Because the Medrash tells us that's how tzaddikim operate. Wherever tzaddikim go, brocha is cast into that environment. Why is that? Because the purpose of the world is to serve as tzaddikim. As we well know, the purpose of the creation of the world was for Yidden and Torah. Is move on. So if that's the purpose of the world, in order to facilitate Yidden doing Torah mitzvahs, then it makes sense. Whenever the world is assisting Jews to fulfill our purpose, to facilitate us being able to serve the Eibishter, that brings the world to its purpose and therefore to its completeness, which includes all of its greatest brachas. Therefore, wherever tzaddikim go, brocha mishtaleches, they bring brocha there. The moment an environment becomes a place where a tzaddik is there doing what a tzaddik has to do to serve the Eibishter, Hashem, well, then that place is part of the facilitation of the tzaddik doing what the Eibishter wants. That brings this particular place and environment to its purpose. That's an art from brocha mishtaleches. So naturally, it's going to have brocha. If you're aligned with doing what the Eibishter wants, then obviously you're going to have bracha. Now, building on that principle, that when a tzaddik is doing what the Eibishter wants, the world that participates in that benefits and has bracha from it, then we can understand the two opinions of whether that's 100-fold or 1,000-fold bracha. As the zwei Deis anal in Zohar, so the two opinions about how the bracha works, they're actually arguing over what does it mean that the world facilitates us doing what the Eibishter wants, and because there are two possibilities of how that could work. We know, generally speaking, that there's the concept of machshirei mitzvah. There are things that facilitate being able to do a mitzvah. We know that there's a principle of messiah, that there's something that can help us to do a mitzvah. So what is the world in our relationship to Hashem? Is it just tools and resources that we use, or is it actually part of the journey of serving Hashem, and that will determine how much bracha is available to the world through our avodah? There's a famous machlokes in Gemara Shabbos, whether or not something which is a facilitation of a mitzvah is something that could override the laws of Shabbos. Rabbi Lezer says, well, you could go and you could burn coals in order to be able to create a knife that you could use for bris milah, all on Shabbos. Even though the knife is only a facilitation for the bris, he believes that that's enough to be able to override Shabbos, because milah is doicha Shabbos. Of the halachis, but we don't follow Rabbi Eliezer halachically, and rather we say if something is only a machshir, if it's only a resource that is going to be required in order to facilitate doing a mitzvah, that is not considered like the mitzvah itself. Now, the Asboras Machlokes is, the logic behind this debate is, they're debating whether the preparation to be able to do a particular action has the same status as the action itself. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer says simply, without these tools, you cannot do this mitzvah, therefore they're part and parcel of the mitzvah. Because there's no way to do this action without the preparation and the resources, therefore their preparation and those resources are considered part of the mitzvah. Therefore, if you have a mitzvah that can override Shabbos, then anything that is part of the preparation for, or the tools of that mitzvah, their details also override Shabbos. Whereas the other Tanoim, who are the majority who we follow halachically, they argue, as Chashman was on comments to Achana, yes, it's true. Of course, you have to have those steps in that preparation, those tools, in order to do the mitzvah. But the fact is, those are only preparation for the mitzvah. So they're not considered of the same stature as the mitzvah itself. And therefore they cannot override Shabbos. That's in the laws of Shabbos, but the principle applies in other areas as well. As we've illustrated, when it comes to the laws of Shabbos, we do not follow Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, and we do not allow ourselves to prepare tools in order to do the bris milah on Shabbos. And the principle, therefore, is that tools for a mitzvah are not necessarily considered like the mitzvah. But there are other scenarios. And in those other scenarios, there are things that help facilitate a mitzvah that are considered on the level of the mitzvah. Specifically, as we're going to see in a moment, the Ran teaches us about the mitzvah of Pru Revu. Divrei Haran Hayuduim. At the beginning of Masechta Kiddushin, the Ran tells us that a woman is not obligated by Torah to have children. But nevertheless, the Ran says, still she has a mitzvah to participate in having children because she is a critical element to assist the husband to fulfill his mitzvah to have children. He cannot do so without a wife. And as the Rebbe explains in a different sikha, in quite a bit of detail about the different levels of how something could be a preparation for a mitzvah or considered already part of the mitzvah. For example, the Yerushalmi that tells us that when you start making a sukkah, you already say a brocha over the sukkah, or something which is considered part of the mitzvah, like the kavanah that you have to have when you're taking the blood to the mizbeach, even though it's not really the mitzvah, but if you mess up the kavanah, it messes up the mitzvah of the zrika, of sprinkling the blood. So there are various levels at which something can be considered a preparation for assistance to or part of a mitzvah. Here we're going to look at two. Aleph yeshlo mitzvah stam. The one is she has a mitzvah. What's the mitzvah? To assist her husband. So because she's assisting her husband to fulfill a mitzvah called pru revu, she has a mitzvah to assist him to do that mitzvah. But her mitzvah is not the same as his mitzvah. His mitzvah is to have children. Her mitzvah is to facilitate him having children. Or or you could argue, because she is an essential element for him to fulfill the mitzvah of having children, is a mitzvah begetted from the mitzvah rabbah from pru revu, then actually her mitzvah is elevated to the level of a very important, great mitzvah of having children. So what are we seeing? Things that are used to facilitate a mitzvah do participate in the mitzvah to some extent. The question is to what extent, and therefore the question is what is their status? Do they also gain some of the holiness of the mitzvah as well, which is going to be relevant to our discussion about how much the world plays a role in serving the Eibishter. So the Chelek zwischen machshir mitzvah hanal v'chazan nitoich Shabbos und dem Fall von Messiah by Isha is moving bepashtos. Now we can clearly distinguish between the story of the mitzvahs, the machshirei mitzvah for a bris and the woman being part of pru revu. They're very different scenarios, because preparing the knife happens before the bris. Pru revu happens simultaneously for the man and the woman. When you're preparing for a mitzvah, there's the mitzvah, which is one activity, and there's a preparation of the tools for the mitzvah, which is a separate activity, which are done at different times. Yes, of course, you have to have the knife in order to do the bris, so it's a critical part of the process, but its only purpose is to service the other activity that has to happen, which is the bris. Which is why it cannot be held at the same level of status as the mitzvah itself, because it is just a necessary precursor to the mitzvah. It's not part of the action of the mitzvah. Whereas the mitzvah of having children is the assistance that the wife gives to her husband to have a child is simultaneously and part of the same action that the husband is doing to fulfill this mitzvah. It's just that technically it's his responsibility, but the activity is a shared activity. Which is why it's absolutely logical that a woman's participation in Piri Verivya should be at a very high level, and possibly even the same level as her husband's mitzvah of Pru Revu, unlike the preparation of a knife for a bris, which nobody would consider to be the mitzvah of having a bris. So, let's apply that further. So our question here is, the preparation for a mitzvah, is that just a secondary element to the mitzvah, like a knife to the bris, or is it part and parcel of the importance of the mitzvah, like a woman in Piri Verivya? We can use that to apply to the nature of creation, which we've described is there for the purpose of servicing the Jewish people, fulfilling Torah. So is it just a tool that we use, a resource in order to fulfill what the Eibishter wants, or is it part of the experience, part of the journey? So we could say, well, there are just tools that exist in the world that are secondary to our mission, which is to serve the Eibishter. And nobody would suggest that the physical world has the same greatness as the Yidden and the Torah, which obviously are what the Eibishter wants. But the fact is, in order to do what Hashem wants, we need the physical elements of this world. That makes the things of the world surely our partners, like the woman assisting the husband in Piri Verivya, the straps of the tefillin are helping me do the mitzvah. So, surely then the world should at least be elevated somewhat to something of the status of the Jewish people and of the Torah. The only way to resolve what the value of the physical world is in the journey to be able to fulfill Hashem's mission of Torah mitzvahs is depending on how we view the world. Do we see the world as an entity which is there to service Hashem, or do we see the world as nothing other than an expression of godliness? So as long as we believe that the world is real, and it is an independent entity that is there to work for us and to help us in our mission to do Torah mitzvahs. Well, in that case, the world doesn't really belong in the realm of our Torah mitzvahs and have the holiness or the elevation of our Torah mitzvahs. That's just like the knife to be used for the bris. Nobody's going to suggest that the knife is a bris. Nobody's going to suggest that the world is part of the kedusha of serving the Eibishter. Just like the knife, production of the knife cannot override Shabbos, because the making of the knife is not part of the mitzvah of the bris, and the existence of the world is not really part of the performance of Torah mitzvahs. But there's another way to look at the world. But I could look at the world through a completely different lens, which is to recognize there is no other purpose to the world besides helping or assisting us to be able to do Torah mitzvahs. In fact, part of Torah in Israel, part of the Jewish people, part of Torah is there need to be straps with tefillin, there needs to be food to be able to fulfill mitzvahs, etc. Chazal in Metzias is l'sham sheni, like the Gemara says in Kiddushin. The whole world is there to service me, and I'm here to service the Eibishter. The only reason the universe exists is to facilitate Torah mitzvahs. There's no other value. Then you can start to distinguish, you can start to detect in our world the greatness of the Yidden and the greatness of Torah in the physical reality. And then, if that's the case, the world gets elevated to be part of our spiritual journey. And the world would be the equivalent of the wife in the story of having children. The world is in the story of performing Torah mitzvahs. Now, with that information, we're going to have a look at something the Rambam says that the Ravid argues against, and we will see that the Rambam is coming from the second view, whereas the Ravid is coming from the first view. Damit kann man euch maßbar sein, die Plukte zwischen der Rambam und Ravid in dem Minium von Shchitas Akum. There's a question about if a non-Jewish person, or more particularly an idolater, shechts an animal, what's the status of the animal? So the Rambam paskant, the Rambam says, Shchitas Akum neveido metame b'masa. If a non-Jewish person shechts an animal, they render that animal a carcass, an avela, which if a person carries it, they become impure. Midivrei Seifrim, and that is a rabbinic law, because the whole concept of impurity associated with idolatry is a rabbinic law. So, therefore, this person is an idolater, and therefore they're in a state of ritual impurity, and they make this animal impure as well. The Ravid is the Ruf Masik und sagt, the Ravid takes issue with this and says, Akam hem kivahemus, a non-Jewish person has no space in the world of Shechita, in the same way as, for example, an animal will have no space in the world of Shechita. They don't have the capacity to impart impurity or receive impurity. The Torah compares them to animals. Says the Ravid, if anybody thinks that a non-Jewish person has any role to play in the laws of Torah, it's like trying to grab the air with your hands. So what's the debate over here? So the Rogatchover explains where the Ravid is coming from. Who has the capacity through an inappropriate shchita to render an animal non-kosher, or that it becomes a carcass which can impart impurity? Only if the entity that is shechting the animal is a recognized halachic legal entity. Whereas from the Ravid's perspective, a non-Jewish person has no legal entity in halacha. Therefore, it's as if there was fresh air shechting this animal. In which case, you can't say that it was mekalkel, that he messed up the shchita. It's like an animal that died of natural causes, which is also treif. Therefore, the act of slaughtering by this non-Jewish person has no legal impact, and therefore, so therefore, why is this animal considered a carcass which can impart impurity? Because it's like an animal that died of natural causes, not because it's like an animal where the person who shechted it did it wrong. Whereas the Rambam says, no, that a non-Jewish person has a role to play in the laws of Shechita, and therefore their Shechita is disqualified. Because the Rambam, unlike the Ravid, says that a non-Jewish person is a halachic entity, is a legal entity within Jewish law. Based on what we've just explained about the different views of how you see the world and the different possibilities of whether something is part and parcel of the holy journey or not, that will explain where the Rambam and the Ravid are coming from. The Ravid will agree that there are beings on this earth who are there to help the Jewish people on their journey, including the non-Jewish world. That is completely accessory. It's like the knife for the bris. It's not part of the mitzvah of the bris. They are not part of our spiritual journey. They are completely accessory. Therefore, they are not recognized in an halachic context as having any part to play in our journey. Mashenkin the Rambam halt, where the Rambam says, "As das was is eigentlich für die Sorge is in an Eufen as bekommen a Sheiches zu Shivas von Torah Yisrael." The Rambam says, no. If there are non-Jewish people in this world who are going to assist the Jewish nation on our spiritual journey, they are now part of the journey. They become elevated to become included somehow in the status. To the extent that halacha recognizes them as players in the spiritual journey. Which will also help us to understand the specifics of how the Rambam defines the mitzvah, the concept of Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. As the Rambam geht alle Shitasoin, the meaning from the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the Rambam here is mirroring his views about Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Where he says, as in Klal von Chesidu Solam, if a person is to be considered a righteous amongst the Gentiles, it is only those individuals who commit to the Sheva Mitzvahs because the Eibishter in Torah instructed non-Jewish people to keep the Sheva Mitzvahs. And that information was imparted through Moshe Rabbeinu. But if they just simply did so because it makes sense that this is a good way to live, such a person is not considered a ger toshav, and they are not considered the righteous amongst the nations. That's a really strange thing. Because we know that Torah mitzvahs were given by Moshe Rabbeinu to the Yidden, not to the rest of the world. So why is the Rambam specifically pegging Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach to the Torah? What connection is there between the experience of Matan Torah and the nations of the world? To the extent that the Rambam insists that the only way they could fulfill Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach is if they acknowledge that this is commanded at Sinai. The explanation is this. It's exactly the point. The Rebbe has clarified before that Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach is not just something to benefit the nations of the world, that they should live in a moral society. That das is bishvil Yisrael, bishvil Torah. The code of the Sheva Mitzvahs is there to facilitate us performing Torah mitzvahs. Why is that? Because to facilitate us being able to do Torah mitzvahs properly, you have to live in a moral, ethical world. A world that is suitable and is able to assist the Jewish people on our journey. Because the value of the non-Jewish world keeping the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach is to create a world that runs as it should, that has morality and values in which we could fulfill what the Eibishter wants. Und der Rebbe halt der Rambam, es darf man keinem sein, diese Sheva Mitzvahs, which is why the Rambam insists that in order for a non-Jewish person to be a righteous Gentile, they have to acknowledge that the source of Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach is the Eibishter's Torah. Just in the same way as we acknowledge that all living things are there to facilitate the spiritual journey of the Jewish nation, which is why the Torah recognizes their metzias, their existence, so that they can facilitate our journey. The same applies to mitzvahs. Their mitzvahs are there to create a world that facilitates the observance of Torah. They have to be conscious of the fact that why are we fulfilling these mitzvahs? The Sheva Mitzvahs, not just to have a nice world in which to live, but to facilitate the goal of creation, which is that the Yidden should be able to serve the Eibishter, which then includes them in the experience of Matan Torah to some extent, which is a major upgrade for the nations of the world. And this insight will help us understand why there are two versions of how the Rambam actually states this halacha. The Girsa of Futzen Rambam is the most common version in the Rambam is that if a non-Jewish person fulfills the Sheva Mitzvahs because they are logical, such a person is not a ger toshav, not a righteous Gentile, nor is he considered a wise Gentile. But there's another version which is found in quite a number of places. That somebody who does the Sheva Mitzvahs because they make sense, but not because of commitment to the Eibishter's Torah, that person is taka, not a righteous Gentile, but is still a wise Gentile. What's the difference? The fact is, actually, the way that the Rambam says it in the most common girsa seems to be very difficult to understand. How does it work? You're saying somebody is fulfilling the Sheva Mitzvahs because it's logical, so therefore they're not considered wise. Surely that's the sign of a wise person, that you do something which makes sense. But now we can understand. As die zwei Gersois in Rambam seinen zwei Fanim, wie man kann lernen Shittas Rambam in der Sheiches, was Sumas Olam bakommen zu Torah. Could be that the two versions of what the Rambam said over here are because the two understandings of what the Rambam meant is the relationship between the non-Jewish world and Torah. Is the other view, which is not so common, that if a person fulfills Sheva Mitzvahs because it's logical, they're considered a wise Gentile. Then the Rambam's message would be, look, we ideally want a non-Jewish person to fulfill the Sheva Mitzvahs because the Eibishter said so. Because we want them also to be sensitive to the idea of Torah and what it represents. But because we could say, similar to what the Rabbi said, that their participation in facilitating Torah is just like a tool that is to an end. So maybe the only way that they could ever experience a sense of Torah is they have to step beyond their intellect. That if it's something which they understand, then that's no longer going to be something that links them to the Torah. In other words, what we're saying over here is, if you want a non-Jewish person to have a plug into the Torah, they have to escape their own intellect. But if they're using their own intellect, you can't expect their intellect to accept that I should do Sheva Mitzvahs because the Eibishter said so. And therefore that opinion says, look, maybe the person was not at that level that they could accept that the Eibishter commanded these Sheva Mitzvahs b'nei Noach, but they could work out logically that they're valuable, so therefore we call them wise. From the perspective of their wisdom and their intellect, they can understand the value of the Sheva Mitzvahs. But when you go with a more popular or more broad version of the Rambam, which is that if a person fulfills the Sheva Mitzvahs out of logic, they're actually not considered wise. That's because the Rambam is saying the only reason that the nations of the world exist is to facilitate Torah. They actually have to become aware of that. It has to seep into their understanding. If they don't understand that their purpose is to help facilitate Torah mitzvahs, then their intellect is lacking. Because that intellect is lacking the real life that it deserves, which is that I'm here to serve the Eibishter. Und das ist the beer in die zwei Deis in Zerben and get the brocha b'mikne Lavan b'schusa shel Yaakov, and this comes right back to the two opinions about how exactly the brocha that Lavan got through Yaakov operated. The chilek zwischen misper 100 and misper 1000 is, we'll understand it by distinguishing, as promised, between what the number 100 versus the number 1000 symbolizes. Meya esapiyam meser is a shlemus habrocha varuboy shemitzad hatev, and the number 100, which is the 10 spheres or the 10 ma'amoros, etc., multiplied by all the 10 faculties, the subcategories within each of them, that represents the absolute version of a natural process. And we see this. There are various things about nature that are associated with the number 100. As that they reach their pinnacle when they're at the number 100. Like, for example, the person reaches the age of 100, Pirkei Avos says that person is now kind of finished off already what they have to do in this world. Or, for example, when a person gets to the ultimate state of reviewing their learning naturally, that's 100 times. And other examples. But the minute you use the number 1000, you're now referring to a type of reality, a complete sense of existence, which is beyond nature. As Elef is Osius Pele, as we know that the same letters of the word Elef are the word Pele, which is something amazing. That's why often we use the number 1000 just as like the ultimate number. So now we can link those numbers to the reality of the Jewish and the non-Jewish world. The non-Jewish world is primarily a world of the natural. Whereas Yidden are designed fundamentally to transcend the nature of the world. We serve the Eibishter with a supernatural commitment. And in dem besteht der Chelek zwischen die zwei Deos in Zohar, which is exactly the two opinions over here in the Zohar about what kind of brochas Lavan got. The first opinion says a non-Jewish person cannot plug in to the supernatural reality of a Jewish person. Therefore, even when that non-Jewish person is fulfilling their objective and serving the Eibishter, and assisting the Jewish people to fulfill their avodah, the maximum brocha they could get as a result of that is natural brocha 100-fold. Rabbi Abba comes along and says, no, it's the ganze Metzius von Masoilim b'shvil HaTorah b'shvil Yisrael. The reality of a non-Jewish person is to be able to facilitate what the Eibishter's purpose is in this world. And therefore they are capable of plugging into and experiencing and enjoying the greatness of the Jewish nation. And therefore, when the non-Jewish world is assisting Yidden to do what the Eibishter wants, the brocha that they get is along the similar lines to the brocha that Yidden get. Which is 1,000-fold brocha, completely beyond the restraints and constraints of the natural reality. This gives us an incredibly powerful lesson about the attitude and relationship that we're supposed to have in the non-Jewish world today. The Eibishter designed the world as Bisman Hagolos is the Matzah von Eden abhängig and a gewisses Mos in the Matzah von Umas Sa'ilam. The way that the Eibishter designed the world is till Mashiach comes, our reality is somewhat reliant on the reality of the world around us. And their relationship to us obviously is going to benefit, hopefully, or God forbid otherwise. Like Yirmiyahu Navi says, you've got to daven for the well-being of the city in which you live, so that if they're at peace, you'll be at peace. At the same time, a Jew has to remember consistently, anytime that a non-Jewish person assists us to do what the Eibishter wants, is that that is to the benefit of that person. That non-Jewish person, now their own real purpose and existence comes to light. That they're there to facilitate the Yidden doing what the Eibishter wants, and therefore they're going to get brochas. We shouldn't be like at their so to speak beck and call, or feeling that they have control over us. First to remember that the nations of the world are like an axe in the hand of the woodchopper. In other words, Hashem, the Eibishter, controls them. But more than that, when they help us, they get brochas. As the Mitzvah Rebbe, whose Yom HaGula is at this time of the year, explains, we always see that whichever nation the Jews are living under, they become the superpower. You see it's happening. As long as the vast majority of Jews lived in that country, referring to the communist regime, it was a powerful country that left all the other nations shaking in the boots. But more recently, when the vast majority of the Jewish nation and its infrastructure has moved to America, became the world superpower. Which now is the power to invoke fear in all other nations, including that nation that was so feared. Not only should we be conscious of this, but the non-Jew knows this subconsciously. To the extent that the subconscious of the non-Jew recognizes my brachas come through you, as Lavan did. To the extent that, like by Daniel, where the people around him couldn't see the nevuah that he had, but it had an impact on them, they were fearful. That happens to the nations of the world. And if the non-Jew has a little bit of insight, like Lavan had, and he expresses, my brachas come through you. And asks, how can I contribute to you? At the very least, subconsciously, they're aware of this, or superconsciously. And therefore, the nations of the world will happily assist us in our journey. Wenn man tut das Sach, was bringt mit sich brocha, bis as vayim lachem umnaich, was soll seven kesaych noch bis man agolus, they'll help us, they'll give us brocha, they'll receive brocha, they'll already start the fulfillment of the prophecy about Mashiach, that the leadership will be those who assist us. On Eden haben Tzarchem Bar Chava, and we'll have whatever we need abundantly. On great and sich zum Zman, when Efech Elam Yisaf Abrur, Kulikar Kulam B'Shem Hashem, Lov T'Shem Echad, that can prepare us for the time where the entire world will serve the Eibush in a singular voice, B'Gula Amitzvah Shleim Al Yidei Mashiach Tzidken, which will happen with the Gula, with Mashiach, right now.